Hello, good night, everyone. Here we are for the second night of RancHER. I'm really excited for you guys to be joining us. And tonight we have Dr. Ruth,
Why
help.
would he? You think it was a question?
I don't know why it's so hard for me. I honestly try so hard. Waiuri, Dr. Waiuri. It is easy peasy, but I don't know why. In my mind, it never goes as it should be. I apologize for that.
No
Um,
problem.
Anyway, so here we are for the second night of RancHER. So last night we had a great night with Dr. Hayes. She's also here with us tonight, and we also have Dr. Katie McCarthy. I'm having a hard time with last names tonight. But regardless, so this is RancHER. This is our second night. This is our fifth edition. We've been doing this webinar series since 2021. And the idea behind of it is to highlight the work of women in agriculture, either as a faculty, either as a rancher, as someone in the industry. We want to just highlight what people are doing out there. So we've changed things a little bit over the years, and this year we are doing a little bit of conversation before the presentations. So if you're not here last night, I just want to give you some housekeeping ideas or rules or whatever. Basically what we do some questions with Ruth to start with, and then we're gonna go to her presentation, and then we're gonna open the floor for questions from the audience, okay? So if you do have questions, feel free to type your questions on the Q&A box. It should be at the bottom of your screen. And there's actually a question there right now asking about if there's recordings of the webinar series. And yes, there will be recordings. Those are going to be available on the YouTube. I will send out an email to everybody that registered for the series whenever those recordings are available. So questions go in the Q&A box, so you can type your questions at any time there. And then at the end, we'll pick some of those questions. Another thing is we always have a door prize. Door prize, there's no doors, but we do some prize drawing here at the end of the night. So if you stay till the end, we're gonna select someone from the audience. So let me see. I think that's basically what I had as some ground rules for tonight. If I will go ahead and read your bio, Ruth, so people are a little bit more aware of your background, right? So, Dr. Ruth Woiwode, now it's easy, is an assistant professor and extension specialist in animal behavior and welfare at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She studies how animals respond to people, facilities, and environments around them, and what those responses reveal about their overall experience. Her approach to studying animal welfare relies on the three circles model, emphasizing how animals function, cope, and behave within their environments. Drawing on behavioral and physiological measures, she examines how animal response can inform better facility design, handler training, and management practice to support sustainable livestock production. As a certified animal welfare auditor for dairy, feedlot, swine, poultry, and meat plant sectors, Dr. Woiwode brings extensive experience in third-party auditing, training, and animal care program development to her work. She leads and advises national efforts to improve welfare standards and education, serving as the chair of the 7th International Symposium on Beef Cattle Welfare, which will happen next year in Lincoln. Very nice. And is also a member of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Beef Innovation Hub Facility Advisory Committee, and also the Professional Animal Auditor Certification Organization. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Well, Ruth, it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. So I just want to give a little bit of an introduction to you all, but can you tell us, in your own words, who you are, what you do, like what brought you to this place you are today?
Sure, Juliana. First, thanks so much for the opportunity to participate. I've been really excited leading up to this. It's been wonderful to see just the network, the community that you've built, and excited that this is the fifth year of RancHER.
Thank you.
So thanks for the opportunity. And then a little bit of background about me. I grew up in North Dakota, which isn't Canada, contrary to some popular beliefs. It's close. It's very far north, but on a homestead operation. It was been in some form of the family since the homestead era, and was exposed to all major livestock species from a really early age. And uh, mostly, I would describe my path to the point that I am today as non-traditional.
Mhm.
I thought that I was going to marry a cowboy when I was young. So I've loved horses and cattle and the cowboy way of life from early childhood. And that led to a number of years where I actually interned with horse trainers and actually spent a lot of time doing day work for ranchers and worked for the local livestock markets too. So have had a lot of experience in a lot of different roles. Maybe contrary, well, a little less known fact is that I earned a business degree on a rodeo scholarship. And then I used that business
Whoa.
degree for a couple of years before going back to school. So I had to switch from business to animal science, and then, of course, had the wonderful opportunity to do my graduate degrees with Temple. And though I had finished my bachelor's in science at Colorado State, I didn't necessarily go there thinking that I was going to study animal behavior and welfare with Dr. Grandin. So, sometimes our best laid plans, it's really interesting how life changes our past. But I was one of those people that thought I was going to go to vet school, because I
Mhm.
knew that a professional track was what I needed at that point in time because I went back to school as a single mom. So I had I was a little bit older, a non-traditional student when I was finishing my undergrad work, and I had the opportunity to get involved in supporting, as an undergrad student, helping with graduate research, both in the animal science department and in collaboration with the vet school there. So that was just a priceless learning opportunity, and it was sort of a natural fit because I had a lot of the hands-on skills already anyway, and I
Mhm.
had some business training, so it suited me well. I could step in and support some of those programs, or even some of those research projects. And I helped graduate students. Oftentimes, I would help them maintain like a double-blind nature of their study, help manage biosecurity protocols for all of the other student workers that were helping with those projects. But without realizing it at that time, I was setting myself up really well for my own research. And of course, as they say, right, the rest is history. But the majority of my research has focused on beef cattle. I've done some work with sheep, I've done some work with swine, a little bit with horses. And in my current job description, I have responsibility to work across all major livestock species, but my passion is beef cattle, and that's primarily where I focus. So I know it was probably a roundabout answer, but hopefully that covered most of the points.
No, and that's awesome. I mean, I do love like how you say that, although you had some experience at home inside a homestead, right? But you have to go very far from where you were and then have a very different non-traditional background to then go back and to work on that. And
Yeah.
I think that's very rich actually because it gives you a vision, right? A 360, whatever vision of the whole process of everything. I really value like outside experiences in the industry too. And you said something about hands-on, like in Brazil, I did my undergrad in Brazil. In Brazil, at least when I was in college, hands-on activities were very, very proeminent. So I was like, that's really nice because whenever I came here to do my master's or work on intern, I knew so much stuff. I knew how to collect blood. I know how to sample
Mhm.
this and that, run the cattle, run the chute. So that was very valuable to me. Like it was maybe on the everyday we don't see the value of it. Maybe students that are listening to us don't like, oh, why am I doing this, right? Like, but at the end of the day, there has a meaning. There's probably a reason why you're doing that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So like moving about like thinking about accomplishments, you already said a bunch, right? But what are the things that you're most proud of accomplishing at this point in your career, or anything that brings you a lot of joy on your everyday? Like maybe we don't see that as accomplishment, but like little things that make you happy to be the professor you are.
Well, I think I'll start with some of the little moments that are harder to capture. And as I realized, even as a student and particularly as a non-traditional student, those aha moments, those light bulb moments when I connected my passion to what I was learning and realized that there were career opportunities. Those moments were very important for me. So as I now mentor graduate students, when I start to see those aha moments, those light bulb moments, those
Mhm.
are some of the most rewarding times that I can think of and that I've experienced really in my career. And those are the types of things that don't really go on a CV, or we don't
No,
get to report the impact of those moments at the end
but
of
is
the
that
day.
like, ooh,
I
right?
know, but those are intangible things when you're actually creating excitement
Yeah.
for the next generation, and when they start to see, oh, this can be a career. I can make a career out of the things that I'm really passionate about, and it doesn't. I mean, obviously, there's an enormous amount of rigor and hard work involved, but it can be really enjoyable and rewarding as well. But one of the things that I'm particularly proud of since joining UNL would be some of the relationships that I brought to the table when I started here with a Nebraska equipment manufacturer, the Daniels Manufacturing Group, and that family. And so I built on that relationship and approached Daniels Manufacturing as the first partner to gift an entire handling system in
Whoa.
the construction of the Classroom and Feedlot Innovation Center. So currently, in its final design, we have two complete systems side by side. And because Daniels was a Nebraska stakeholder, it was just critical that they were first to the table. But we also have an AeroQuip system. And so
Mhm.
what's really unique about this facility now, and we're on our third turn of cattle in this system right now. We're receiving the last 500 cattle this Friday, is that we have the ability to, for the first time, study the influence of handling systems side by side. So obviously drawing on some of my time studying with Dr. Grandin and that learning that she's captured over her career and that I've been able to draw on from my time studying with her. But
Mhm.
this represents something that doesn't exist currently at another land grant in the country. So we're really excited about that. And we've got some of the preliminary data, and I'll touch on a little bit of that just at the end to
Mhm.
help give you some sense of what we're able to study, but also what we're seeing on a preliminary basis. So those are a couple things I'm really proud of.
Yeah, and that's awesome. I remember, I guess, maybe you did tell me whenever we were in Mexico about
Yeah.
it, the
Uh-huh.
two. Yeah, so I think I remember now you talking about it, and I think this is really cool because and you should be really proud of it because it opens a lot of possibilities for research, right? Things
Mhm.
we don't know. I mean, whenever we work in Cal, I always get a little aggravated when things are going slow because I don't like them being in the chute too long or too squeezed. So I also feel like that could give possibilities to us understand like on the timing of processing and things like that. So that's
You're
really, really
exactly
cool.
right. You're
That's really
exactly
cool.
right. Uh-huh.
Very nice. So we were talking earlier about, how hard it's been in academia and things like that. Things are weird lately. So what are skills or mindsets or support system that you have developed over the years to, you know, keep you motivated and, keep going, moving forward? Or if you have a role model that you always look up to and be like, hey, this is what you would do.
Well, it would be I'd be remiss, I think, if I didn't mention Temple. So
Yeah.
obviously having the opportunity to study with Temple and really to become friends with her has probably been one of the just the most profound experiences of my life. And somebody when things are really, really tough, I find myself as much this year as any time before saying, goodness, I mean, imagine what Temple experienced. And that kind of helps put some of the things that we encounter and the things that we struggle with into perspective.
Yeah.
And certainly that's not to undermine some of the difficulty that we were touching on earlier. I mean, starting as a faculty member in the middle of COVID and a number of other challenges, those are certainly, they bring their own difficulty. But to have overcome some of the things that Temple overcame
Mm-hmm.
throughout her life, I mean, that's a role model that I look up to every day, that I draw inspiration from, and encouragement from. And she's somebody that I can text or call, reach out to when I'm struggling with a situation, and she can usually help me just put it into perspective in a really pragmatic way. One of the things, though, that I think has been just really important for me is to ensure a couple things. First of all, that I am focused on the type of work and research that I get uh, enjoyment from, even in the middle of challenge and struggles. So you'll hear me talking a little bit about some of the handler skill work a little bit later. That's something that is incredibly exciting for me. So regardless of how much struggle and difficulty we might encounter, like that's something that gets me excited. So I get out of bed every day excited about that, but also finding outlets outside of work and a
Mm-hmm.
community outside of work has been really helpful for me. So when I was in Colorado before moving here, I had a huge soccer community and I played soccer all the time. So that was a wonderful physical outlet for me. And of course there's a mental component to that game too, which I really appreciated. But that created a lot of balance for me.
Mm-hmm.
And again, that type of fulfillment, um, recognizing our needs as very complex individuals also, and feeding those needs that we have in many areas helps bring balance. And sometimes just that opportunity to step away from the job is really healthy. And that I think contributes to the ability to regenerate energy, to continue to find energy in challenging times, and happiness and balance.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I totally agree with you. Like I think having going back to the very first point, like having Tempo as a role model and someone you work with and someone you can text and be like, hey, sorry, I have to put it out there. I'm completely jealous, right? Uh, I just love it. I just love it. In fact, I do. So for every person that comes to my lab, we do have a training worksheet, and
Yes,
one of the last requirements is to watch her movie. I was like, if you don't know this lady, do yourself a
right.
favor, right? Watch her
Exactly
movie.
right.
But I really like the point you made of saying like thinking about the adversities she has been through in her career, right? Like I think like we were talking about how difficult things have been in the last 5 years for us, young faculty and everything. But also others have challenges before too. I think so looking with those lenses always help to move
Yeah.
forward and like what would she do, right? Like find inspiration there. And then also on finding joy on the whatever you're doing, you're doing it because you like it, right? Like the
Right.
research you like, if you find little joys every day. So I do that too. I try to, if it's not something that I feel value or application for a producer, or if it makes no sense to me, I'm not gonna be spending my time doing it because it's hard. It's a hard job. So why would you not enjoy what you're doing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And then like the last part of having, I love that you play soccer. Like I'm from Brazil. It's a big thing in Brazil, right? So
Right.
I love that you'll find an outlet in that sport. So that's really nice.
Yeah.
But going back to, so you just mentioned Tempo as a role model, and she's also women in our industry. One more question I have is like, this is a male-dominated field still. We see more and more women, but it's still very male-dominated industry. So have you ever encountered any situation that you feel like, yeah, this is because I'm a woman, how have been out of that situation, or if that never happened to you, do you have any advice or anything you want to share on that line?
So I think, as I've thought about that question, but more broadly as a woman, where I think there's more focus on diversity and perhaps the challenges or disadvantages that women may encounter. I think it's easy sometimes to think when we encounter challenges that it's because we're women. And while that may or may not be true, I've also been challenged sometimes to step back and think about all of the other things that are different about what I'm doing that are not specifically because I'm a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not meaning to downplay the role of women at all, but my trajectory, though separate from Temple's, has some similarities where she encountered a lot of resistance because she was talking about a different way of doing things or thinking about things, so, and a different discipline. So
Mm-hmm.
that was, um, you know, novel for the people that she was around early in her career, where she encountered a lot of that resistance initially. She will tell you that the majority of her challenge and her struggle was not because she was autistic, but because she was a woman, and particularly in the 70s certainly would, and we think about the how old the field of animal behavior welfare is, and really it's only about 60 years old. So she would have been experiencing some of that friction when that field was really emerging. So she was a pioneer in many regards.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, what I've experienced is that there's still a lot of unfamiliarity with my discipline because it's relatively new. So if you think about, I'll give my position here would be a great example. So at the University of Nebraska, there was not an animal behavior and welfare person before they created my position, and I was hired into that position. So there are some similarities in terms of even among my colleagues and in the institute here of learning what this discipline is about and what it has to offer because it's so relatively new compared to
Mm-hmm.
disciplines like nutrition and reproduction that have, rich history of decades and decades and decades. So I'm in this interesting place also where I am a female. I'm in a position that hasn't existed here before. So I do encounter challenge and difficulty. And I think I've been challenged to think about it in the big picture, like that it is not just because I'm a woman, but it's as much about the difference in terms of what I'm studying and researching and learning, and how that comes into play in the context of, we have these really rich histories and tradition of whether it's livestock judging and nutrition, these things that have been around, judging, for example, hundreds of years. And this is relatively new. So I have to give a lot of people the benefit of the doubt when I'm experiencing what I think is resistance to me, or I'm challenged and I could perceive it as being because I'm a woman. So my advice to any young woman in whether it's agriculture or this field is focus on what you're passionate about and lean into your strengths. You'll be able to overcome any of those challenges and difficulty. And look at the people, the women that have blazed trails before us, that have overcome a lot of adversity, whether it is because of being female or for other reasons. So where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And you brought something to the table very interesting of like the perception of your discipline and how new it is and how that adds a layer of challenge to the conversation, right? So, but you're totally right. If there's a will, there's a way. And, like I I think it's like show your passion, right? Like show like
Right.
bring those to the table, and that's usually get away with any type of like that.
Exactly.
Very good.
Yeah.
Very good. So you kind of touch in on early like giving an advice to other women, but what about like general, younger generation that wants to get into to agriculture or or students? I actually forget to share I had a survey going on. So we have half of percent, no, the majority of our attendees tonight are producers. Then the second largest attendee number is student. Then we have some people in research and extension, a light industry, a lot of people from the west of US. There's quite a bit international folks joining tonight. You guys Midwest are not so much. I guess they get you all the time. So a lot of people that have joined already multiple times, first times too. So, and everybody's here to learn more, gain new skills and knowledge. So just going back. So if we think about, early career students in the field, what advices I guess we would do to people trying to get into the ag or beef cattle industry, and even maybe newer producers. I do know a lot of producers that are joining us are just starting. So I know I'm just adding to the question. Sorry.
No, absolutely. I think what you're getting at is really important. And probably the common denominator for all of us on the webinar and your panelists, your presenters these couple of days is that we all have a passion for agriculture and for producers. What gets me most excited and provides the most motivation for me is identifying practical solutions for
Mhm.
people across very differing types of operations and enterprises and being able to problem solve regardless of the size of the operation. And that's the beauty of the beef cattle industry. And I've worked across a lot of species and sectors, did a lot of work in the dairy sector, somewhat in the feedlot sector. But the cow-calf side is perhaps the most diverse
Mhm.
if we think about livestock. And so whether it's size, breeds, even how we're managing cattle, whether it's really extensive conditions or more confinement using crop residues, depends on our environment and what's available to us. But as such, our challenges are going to be very specific to the enterprise and being able to help problem solve and help support the people that are doing the most important work every day. That's one of my biggest sources of motivation. I love agriculture. I love the Western way of life. I find immense reward in hands-on work, working with animals themselves directly and seeing differences. We'll talk a little bit about handling and stockmanship, that type of thing. So I love doing stockmanship demonstrations and helping illustrate the power of visual communication with cattle
Mhm.
and understanding their differences, how they perceive the world. So that's just a part of what I find enjoyment in. And typically across the country, regardless of where producers are from, when I interact with them, there's that common denominator too, is you can find that spark, that passion,
Yeah.
that drives a lot of what they do. And connecting over that is something that I find really, really rewarding. So if we're thinking about opportunities for students, for young people, the opportunities are endless because there's so much diversity in agriculture. Really, the sky's the limit. We're seeing all kinds of examples of people that are creating new niche markets, and whether that's from uh, pasture to plate type of production, even doing their own box beef marketing, or whether we're just raising calves, to market those. There's again, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, being proactive and being able to find solutions, to find that passion, right? I think that's being able to serve. I think we had a little bit of that conversation yesterday. Like we want to help people. So I think that that's like be ready to help others. I guess that's a good takeaway. Very good.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we're getting ready to get to your talk. So what is one thing that you really want the audience to know? Like if there's one take home message, like you should know this by the end of tonight.
Well, I'm hoping that as I talk a little bit about behavior and then even some of the models, the frameworks for how we think about animal welfare and how behavior fits into that. And then we'll talk a little bit about vision and perception as it relates to managing and moving, handling animals successfully, effectively, and safely. One of the things that I want people to keep in mind is it's really helpful to always remind ourselves that we're dealing with animals that don't have language. So as such, and Temple's stressed this across her career, we have to recognize the value of the stimuli that they experience and how we can control and manage that stimuli, both in through our movement, but other factors in the environment. So being intentional in our day-to-day interaction with animals is something that I hope we can all take away, and hopefully there'll be the opportunity to illustrate that a little bit and perhaps lead to some good questions at the end too.
Very good. Being intentional. That's the take home message. Not just about working with animals, I guess everything, right?
Right.
Um, Ruth, I think those are the questions I have for you before your presentation. Is there anything else that we didn't touch that you want to share? Anything that I think I tried to go with my list of questions here. Did I forget anything? Um,
No, I think the last piece that I could have maybe elaborated on more just from my perspective is that while being intentional, also slowing down. Right? When at the pace in which our lives transpire, the technology treadmill, that we're feeling that acceleration every day. If we can slow down when it comes to working with cattle and one, enjoy some of the moments, but take some of that pressure off of us and off of them, it'll be worth it.
yeah, that's a really good point. I appreciate that. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, with that, I think I'm gonna just let you take the screen and I'll be quiet here and listen to what you have, and then we'll do questions from the audience after your talk.
All right. Well, I was able to share earlier, so let's make sure that I can
We'll do
share
that.
again now. Everything looking good? Okay,
Yes, all good.
great.
Thank
So, would
you.
want to go ahead? You were going to
I
say
was
something.
just going to say thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. Thanks for those questions and a wonderful lead into what I want to talk about this evening. So, just a little other background, and we talked a little bit briefly about the opportunity that I had to do both of my graduate degrees with Temple. And one of the things I wanted to share as also that I hope will be inspirational to students and to the next generation is comes from Temple. And at one point in time, she was asked, and for those of you that may know her story and are familiar with that, at one point she had actually designed a squeeze machine that she used on herself, and that helped her cope with some of the stimuli and how that elicited, responses in her. So she appreciated of course the concept of a squeeze chute for cattle, and that's kind of what developed or what inspired her to develop her own squeeze machine. Is she recognized that there was this calmative effect when with that pressure, that contact, that firm pressure. So she created her own squeeze machine that she used on herself, and that's shown in the movie. You get a little bit of a sense of that. And at one point in time, she was giving a seminar in the animal science department at Colorado State when I was still a grad student there. And one of her colleagues, one of the faculty members there, asked a question, and their intent with asking that question was to help other graduate students understand how much she had grown and that she continued to grow over her career. And they said, so Temple, do you still have your squeeze machine? Do you still use that? And she said, no, it broke a while ago. Today, now I rely more on people like my friend Ruth for hugs. And give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. Like I was so self-conscious at that time that here I was being called out in front of the entire faculty and grad student in seminar. But what I quickly realized was what was so important about what she had said. It took me a moment to realize it. She had called me her friend while I was still her grad student. And that's something that as is profound for me and has continued to, I think, inform our relationship and how we interact over the years. I've got a story to tell, and then I promise I'll get into the topic. But so I still lived in Colorado for a number of years after I graduated and completed my postdoc at New Mexico State when I went to work for a company called Food Safety Net Services, and I essentially built their on-farm animal welfare division of the company. So I was based out of Colorado, and I traveled every week until we were shut down during COVID. And so I started at UNL in August of 2020, but the first half of the year, I was still working for Food Safety Net Services and traveling a lot until we were immediately shut down. And for those of you that have any sense of what Temple's schedule is like, she also travels somewhere around 300 days a year. So she went from that kind of travel schedule to being completely shut down, and she was going stir crazy. So even amid the sheltering and distancing time, she reached out and just needed some human interaction. So she started coming over to my place. And initially, what we'd do is I'd order takeout food and we'd sit outside in an environment that, we felt comfortable with. And as the weeks went on, as it was getting closer to the time that I was going to be moving away, she started coming out more frequently and staying longer. And anyway, that was a really special time in our relationship. We really grew even closer then. And so I'll forever be grateful for that summer and for the memories that we built then, in addition to all of the other memories. Anytime you want to know about road trips with Temple while I was in grad school, I've got some great stories. So happy to share some of those at any point if you've got questions. So setting the stage for what I want to talk about this evening, it's really important when we talk about animal behavior to understand how it relates to welfare. They're not interchangeable, but they're definitely related. So the role of behavior in understanding, assessing, measuring welfare is really important, both for production every day, but also in my role. How does domestication fit into this story? We'll weave that through a little bit because we're dealing with domesticated animals, which have unique characteristics that really deserve our attention. And then as we think about the workforce side, the day-to-day management of cattle, and how that presents perhaps occupational challenges. We'll talk a little bit about the specifics of cattle behavior and perception, like perhaps specifically their vision, how they perceive their environment, and why it's really important for us to understand that well in order to manage them well in whatever environment we're talking about, whether that's production, whether that's research, whatever that might be. Okay. So I'll give you first just one of the definitions of animal welfare, and there are many, but animal welfare is defined by the World Organization for Animal Health as the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives and dies. So the conditions in which it lives, that's every day, day in, day out. Those are the things that we're responsible for all the time. But specifically because we're dealing with domesticated animals and not wildlife or exotics, for example, it that really plays an important part in the consideration of what's different in terms of their life now that they're domesticated. And that includes ensuring them a painless death and dignity in death, too. What's different in how an animal's life ends while they're in domestication versus in completely natural conditions or in the wild, that looks very, very different. And that's one of the responsibilities that we'll talk about. So some of the frameworks, as we talked a little bit in the past few moments about even the field of animal welfare science, and how relatively new it is, there's some important frameworks that we'll talk about that help us understand and define welfare so that we can better manage and assess it. And originally, animal welfare was described as the five freedoms. Those are freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from fear and distress, freedom from heat stress or physical discomfort. So that has to do with their environment, and then freedom from pain, injury, and disease, and then freedom to express normal patterns of behavior. But as the field developed, we realized that even to describe animal welfare as freedoms wasn't necessarily entirely accurate or functional, because to say that an animal should be free from hunger and thirst would then imply, right, that they should never experience hunger and thirst. And as we think about the freedom to express normal patterns of behavior and the value of specific behaviors, an animal has to experience hunger and thirst in order for them to be motivated to eat and drink. And those are healthy, normal behaviors. So we moved a little bit more to describing those freedoms as domains. And then that would have been the nutrition domain instead of freedom from hunger and thirst. Essentially, we thought about their needs then in those domains. Freedom from fear and distress, right? That we're talking about mental suffering. And then the environment is what we think about in terms of domains, whether that's heat stress, any other physical features. But one of my favorite models for talking about animal welfare is the three circles model. And the three circles model is the most recent. So we've just talked about the five freedoms, the five domains, and now the three circles. So in a relatively short period of time, from 1965 to 1997, we've already evolved that quickly in the field of animal welfare science. And I'll describe the three circles of animal welfare pretty basically. And really, the three circles integrate everything that we talked about just a moment ago, whether we describe it as freedoms or domains. But it's a little bit more simple and easy to think about. So the three circles are biological functioning, which would suggest, right, good health, access to veterinary care, those types of things. The underlying biological processes of animal life. Natural living is where behavior really comes in, and we think about an animal's ability to live a reasonably natural life, perform behaviors that are species-specific behaviors that are highly motivated, that have a certain amount of value to them evolutionarily. And then affective states, or essentially how an animal experiences their environment. Access to things that make them feel good. That might be environmental enrichment. It could even be social interaction with conspecifics or other animals of the same species, right? So what's unique about domesticated animals, and why do we even start the conversation with this? Well, the human-animal relationship, as we talk about it, was really established about roughly 10,000 years ago with domestication, and those time frames vary depending on species. So of the approximately 6 million species of animals that have been formally identified, somewhere less than 100, depends on who you talk to, maybe 20, maybe 50 or 60 of those species have ever been fully domesticated. And why does that matter? It matters because there are characteristics of those animal species that deserve our attention because those characteristics distinguish them significantly from those millions of other species that have never become fully domesticated. I mentioned a moment ago their need for social interaction. So the animals that have become fully domesticated in our livestock species rely on numbers for safety and support, but they're also highly social. So while we talk about our fascination with animals and our interest in their behavior, their nature, we've been watching them and curious about them for thousands of years. We'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't realize that the possibility that they were interested in us as well. They've been watching us and interested in us over that same period of time. And arguably, what we don't account for enough in agriculture with domesticated livestock species is the value of the human in quality of life for domesticated species. Certainly, we think about why we domesticated them and the mutual benefits that we gain through that domestication, that relationship. One of the things that it's called is the ancient contract. The term is used to describe really that relationship that was established approximately 10,000 years ago. That's a round number just for easy discussion. And it's really easy for us to come up with the reasons, the benefits that animals get, right? We give them protection from the elements, but also from predation. We ensure their reliable access to food, water, shelter. We give them care, medical care. I mentioned a little while ago that quality of life and dignity in death, but the companionship. We often think about companionship in terms of what animals give us. And while they provide for many of our needs, in the past it was through draft, transportation, and today more through food security, all of the food products that they provide. They certainly provide companionship for us. And we don't always think about this in terms of livestock. We might think about it more in terms of pets or what we would call companion animals, dogs and other species similar to that. But we actually, if you think about your why and you think about the why of almost anybody that you talk to in agriculture, why we do what we do, it's because of the quality of life that we experience and from interaction with caring for animals day in, day out, experiencing the life cycle, new life with birth of calves, and yes, the challenges of loss of life that occurs in that life cycle. But arguably, what's really important for us to consider is that likewise, the animals that we've domesticated became domesticated because of the value that they gain from the human presence in their life as well. And it goes beyond just food security for them and protection from the elements and predators, but it's quite literally the quality of life that they get from interacting with humans and bonding. And for many of you, you can think it's easy to think of some of those relationships that you've built maybe with one animal or two or a handful. But those are great examples of this, the idea of the ancient contract. So as we move into setting the stage for some of the occupational challenges that I'll talk about and what drives where some of my research is focused is this idea that even though there's that social dynamic and that interest, working with cattle is inherently dangerous. It's actually one of the most dangerous occupations that there is. More people die from working with cattle than any other animal each year in the US. Why is it important to think about this? Also, very, very few of our resources, if we think about occupational resources, are invested in adequately training our workforce and helping reduce their risk. There are really important things to know when we're thinking about what contributes to risk working with cattle. While cattle are domesticated, they're still prey animals, which means that evolutionarily, every stimuli that they encounter, they're weighing from that perspective of its relevance to their survival. Is this a threat? How big of a threat? And so their initial response is protective. And for them, their primary defense is flight. We talk a lot about the flight or fight response in cattle, and that's instinctive. It's hardwired. It's something that's very difficult to, if you will, even train animals out of. But it contributes to unpredictability, which also then contributes to risk. And oftentimes, handlers are injured and often, and in some cases, killed when cattle are simply trying to escape. There's times when we talk about that fight or flight response, that activation or escalation when it appears that an animal is more, as we call it, on the fight. It's helpful sometimes to think about that as an escalation of the flight response. Their primary means of defense is flight. When they can't immediately escape by flight and a person happens to be in their way, that's often when that response will escalate and it will appear that an animal comes after a human. And oftentimes it's just an aggravated attempt to escape and humans happen to be in the way. Okay. So understanding, again, that biological basis of behavior is really important to help us improve handling. Understanding behavioral principles and concepts and how cattle experience their environment, what the sensory characteristics are of stimuli, that helps handlers to take advantage of and work with natural behavioral tendencies, natural behaviors for cattle to achieve low stress handling. Low stress handling, understanding those natural behaviors can improve overall safety for humans and efficacy of cattle handling. Proper handling results really in more efficient handling processes. Remember, I said a little while ago, if we slow down, oftentimes the amount of time that it takes us to accomplish a task, working a set of cattle, we'll end up spending less time if we slow down. And it seems counterintuitive, but it's something that's important. It's one of those important principles to keep in mind. If we're not rushing cattle, we'll end up being able to get smoother movement, get good movement. So cattle really experience the environment through their senses. That's one thing that Temple has illustrated really well. She helped put it into terms that in ways that we hadn't well understood it beforehand. So they think or perceive the environment really with their eyes, their ears, their nose. They also really respond to touch. And because they're grazing animals, they do rely a lot on taste. That influences a lot of their preferences, even for plant species when grazing. But it's really important to think about those four primary methods of perceiving stimuli: chemical, which is taste and scent; tactile or touch; auditory, sound, hearing sounds in the environment; and vocalization. That's how animals communicate with one another. And then visual, posture, orientation. So as we think about cattle as grazing animals, one of the principles that we know to be important, right? We want to avoid handling a lone animal, that's more risky. Why? Because they're already activated. They're naturally on guard, if you will. We recognize that we want a minimum of 3 animals in a group for all of their full complement of natural behaviors to be present. That's when they feel most comfortable. And even as how they orient when they're grazing reflects both their vision and how they perceive the environment. Well, so why is understanding all of this important? And why do we talk about livestock and cattle being prey animals? Once again, everything that they experience that's filtered through the lens of survival. It's not, do I like this or do I not like this? It's, am I going to survive? Do I need to escape? So every stimulus, whether it's sound, movement, right? Touch, all of those stimuli are filtered for cattle through that perspective of what is the threat? How is this relevant to survival? Is this threatening enough that it elicits a fight or flight response? And if we think about most of our interactions with cattle, what I would encourage you to think about, and it's this other takeaway that has to do with that intentionality that I mentioned before we jumped into slides. It's that idea of if we can avoid having cattle in that fight or flight response when we're working with them, when we're caring for them, when we're feeding them, providing veterinary care, whatever it might be, if we can avoid eliciting that fight or flight response, that is perhaps the most important thing that we can do. And the earlier that we can learn to do that, and the earlier that we can, if you will, condition or acclimate cattle to our presence and our movement patterns so that they're familiar with those, when we don't activate the fight or flight response, we stay away from, we avoid conditioning them, providing an opportunity where they learn to be activated in our presence. And that's really what we are after as we think about stockmanship and the value of understanding behavior of cattle for managing them optimally and thinking about what it means for their welfare. But one of the things that we maybe don't talk about quite as much with cattle is that fawn or freeze response. So I said a moment ago that if we think about flight, then fight maybe being an escalation of that fear response. I'd offer to you that fawn or freeze is even the greatest escalation of that response. What's the value of fawning or freezing for a prey animal? Is if when they can't escape or hurt a predator, if they appear dead, most predators won't attack or eat them. For many predators, they're those hardwired patterns that elicit attack are driven by movement. So when their prey doesn't move, they won't pursue them. They won't attack them. So if you think about that escalation, we have flight first, then fight if we can't escape. And then if we can't escape, we're going to freeze and fawn and pretend, play dead. Okay. You've also heard about that when talking if you're pursued by a bear, right? So it's that same idea. Most predators rely on movement patterns that draws them to attack, but it also, there's a preference on the part of most predators to want to eat something that's alive or to consume something that's alive. And if there isn't movement, part of that signaling is absent. So I'm going to focus a lot on cattle vision because vision for prey animals versus predators is very, very different. And cattle have what we call wide angle vision. Their eyes are mounted on the side of their head. Depending on the source, it's described as maybe 270 to 300 degrees that they can see peripherally around them, but they have what we call binocular vision, or rather monocular vision, and they're dichromats. And I'll show you in a moment what that means. So we're all aware that cattle don't see directly behind them because of the placement of their eyes. But one of the things that we also don't think about all the time is that they also don't see really well directly in front of them simply because of the anatomical structure of their head, the bridge of the nose, as you think about how those eyes are placed wide on the side of their head. So, what does it mean when cattle have monocular vision? We have binocular vision, and most predators do as well. So, our eyes are mounted more towards the front of our faces. And if you think about the field of vision for each eye, there's a significant overlap between our left eye and our right eye. The same is true for most predators. What that overlap does with um, binocular vision is it contributes to really good depth perception. So predators need to be able to judge distance and closing, depth perception. Cattle with monocular vision don't have that kind of depth perception in front of them. So they can see perpendicular lines on the horizon while their head's down grazing. They can see that without even having to lift their head because that's really appears well in their field of vision. They don't have to have depth perception to see that. But to be able to see what's in front of them, they have to put their head down. That's why cattle will sometimes balk or slow down when we're moving them. So think about entering a building or where there's a change in flooring, shadows, that type of thing. That is often appears as perhaps a cliff for cattle. That's why they have to put their head down. So again, back to that idea of giving them time when we're working with them, slowing down. If we allow, especially that sentinel, the lead animal, to check out their environment and see that the path in front of them is safe, once they start moving, right, the herd will respond. Others will follow them pretty easily. So back to what monocular vision means. Think about the left eye being able to see that dark blue, the right eye being able to see that tan color. So cattle experience their world, if you will, one eye at a time. Why does that matter for us when we think about moving them through facilities? Is that we need to give them opportunities to see with the eye that they're maybe moving towards. And so if cattle are looking one direction and we bring them into a facility, oftentimes, right, what will they do? Sometimes they'll melt, they'll turn around. Well, we don't like that because it slows down movement. Often what's happening is they're getting the opportunity to get a 360-degree perspective of whether it's a crowd pen or the holding area that or whatever situation we might be moving them through. So giving them the opportunity that they need to assess their environment and to ensure that it's safe, or even what they need to know about that environment so that they can move through it comfortably. Now, what does it mean that cattle are dichromats? We've all heard about red and bulls, but we also know that cattle don't see color. So when we talk about them being dichromats, what that means really is that they experience the world in more or less grayscale. So color that we see like this would be more how cattle would see it. Okay. So if we think about contrast, then light and dark with little ability to perceive depth, that's really critical because two colors, dichromat, for example, right, that provides little resolution or little information about, again, depth. So allowing cattle the opportunity to move at their chosen pace, not be too pressured, check out their environment visually. lower their head as they need, that type of thing. That's all critical for them to feel comfortable and to what did we say a little while ago? To ideally avoid eliciting that fight or flight response. Because when cattle become uncomfortable, when they're uncertain about their environment, what happens? They immediately become vigilant, right? As a prey animal, that's one of their natures. And our job when we're handling them is to avoid that every chance we get. So just another way of visualizing the areas that cattle don't see really well, they can see a ways out in front of them, but not directly, close to their feet. So again, accounting for that as we're moving them through different environments. We talk a lot about flight zone and the point of balance. And this is important as we think about visual communication and pressure, as well as the release of pressure. So again, cattle don't see well behind them. And what's important as we think about flight zone and point of balance is not necessarily these specific angles and that those are always fixed, but that's guidance. Those zones will change based on context. So as we get closer to cattle and we're in the corral, that their flight zone will shrink, that point of balance will change. Oftentimes that point of balance actually moves further forward. When we're out in pasture in more extensive environments, that flight zone expands and also that point of balance changes. So realizing that these are principles that are important to know, but also keeping in mind that there's some flexibility. A principle isn't a hard and fast rule. It changes based on context. But one of the big things that if we think about the problems or things that we want to avoid, is this idea of mixed signals. So if we think about how important visual communication is for cattle, oftentimes once we're in a facility, we're working them through maybe the single file, a handler will often tend to stand towards the front of the animal and reach back and tap them on the hip. So visually, they're standing ahead of the point of balance, which would signal them to stop or move back. And yet we're tapping them, and we're providing a sensory stimulus using touch, that tactile sense, towards the rear of the animal, wanting them to move forward. Arguably, in that context, the visual stimuli will take precedent, right? It's more important. They're feeling more pressure from that. The threat, of the touch isn't as threatening. It isn't felt as quite as much pressure in that context. So keep those things in mind. Bud Williams talked about the principle of the zigzag movement when we're gathering cattle on pasture. And it's really not so much about zigging and zagging as it is what we're doing with visual communication. So by moving to the left side of the animals, we're making visual contact with the left eye. By moving to the right, we're making visual contact with the right eye. We're providing guidance and we're using pressure and release. So if we show up on the right side and we perhaps provide a little bit of pressure and then we take it away, that's a reward, right? So again, just some principles that are really important to apply in context. Talked a little bit a moment ago about some of the common mistakes, and I see the slide says it's in a feedlot setting. It might not be a feedlot setting. It might be on a cow-calf operation. It could be in your backyard, right? The concept really holds regardless of the context. So I mentioned early on one of the takeaways that I wanted you to leave with was this idea of slowing down and being intentional. And so a common mistake, as I describe it, is agitation. And by agitation, I mean that we're constantly moving or agitating. You think about the wash cycle in your washer. It agitates, right? It's movement, even subtle movement, right? That's for a purpose. We're so used to being busy, busy, busy in everything that we do, every other context, that we have to check ourselves and be intentional about slowing down, pausing when we're working with cattle. Practice the pause. That's one of the most important things we can do to release pressure and to give cattle the opportunity to move freely. That pause is really important for them to keep them out of that fight or flight, to avoid activation of that response. So keeping them calm, being patient. We often have to be patient and intentional in order to accomplish that. I mentioned a moment ago that idea of mixed signals. We have to think about our actions and how we're being perceived from the viewpoint of cattle. That's why I spend so much time breaking down how cattle see, how they perceive their environment. Have you ever had difficulty moving cattle into a building? Then think about how long it takes for your vision to adjust. Like when you've been outside and you come inside, it takes you a little while, right? 20, 30 seconds. Did you know that it takes cattle up to 5 minutes sometimes for their eyes to adjust? That's partly because they're dichromats and have monocular vision, so they don't have depth perception the way we do. Their eyes don't function the same way. Being aware of those kinds of things is really, really important. It's just imperative when we think about setting them up for success, when we need to accomplish something for their benefit, whether that's maybe it's spread checking, whatever it might be, right? So thinking about what we're trying to accomplish and how we can set them up to be successful. Slowing down. The more pressure we put on cattle, the worse off they're going to be. The more likely we will to wreck equipment, have runaways, all kinds of issues, right? Allow them that time to inspect their facilities and check for those objects. Give them that opportunity to feel comfortable. So as I know I feel like I've gone on a little long, so I want to talk just at a high level about some of the research that we're working on in my lab and how it's connected to these principles and also really to everyday management. You can largely categorize most of the work in my lab into kind of these two main categories where we're looking at practices, whether that's related to handler's skill, how we're actually working cattle through facilities, or whether it might be something like acclimation practices. And one of the things that we've been focusing on in some of our acclimation or the practices work would be an extension of some of Ronaldo Cook's work that he would have done while he was there at Oregon State. And with 7-month-old heifers, he exposed them to handling facilities frequently enough that the cattle, those heifers that were exposed at 7 months, because of their familiarity and that comfort, they reached puberty earlier than their counterparts that didn't have those that acclimation or that exposure opportunity. Similarly, a lot of clinicians will talk about the idea of opening the facilities up to move cattle through so that they'll be comfortable, less likely to balk or to cause problems the next time we actually go to work them. So, and there's some recent work out of K-State that also looks at the reproductive implications when we've given cattle that opportunity. And we have higher success rate of breeding our females when we've given them those opportunities. And some of my doctoral work looked at the impact of initial handling practices. So when cattle enter the feed yard, if they experience something aversive, we saw in that particular study that some of those aversive experiences affected cattle over the 200-day feeding period. And so we're following up on that. And what we're learning in real time right now, it's supporting our hypotheses. So in giving cattle the opportunity to move through a novel facility one time before we actually work them, we see that they move through the facilities more readily the next time, that they're easier to catch, and remember that freeze, they're less likely to freeze. So if you think about working cattle in a chute, sometimes we'll restrain them, and then when we open that front catch, sometimes they'll pull back, they'll balk, and they'll sit in the back of the squeeze chute, and it's hard to get them out. What we believe that to be about is that fawn response. So when we restrain cattle in the chute initially in a novel facility that they've never been in before, we've taken away that opportunity. What's their primary defense? We've taken away flight. So if we restrain them, even if what we're doing isn't particularly aversive, their first experience is removing one of their most important mechanisms of survival. So by acclimating them, allowing them to move through the facility without restraint initially, what have they learned? They've learned that there wasn't anything aversive that happened in that facility and that they can go to a holding pen, to their home pen, they can eat, access food and water. So what happens then on the subsequent event, what we're seeing is that once released, then they move out smoothly. So if you think about translating that to ROI, it took approximately 30 minutes to acclimate 200 head of cattle to to these handling facilities. And then we talked about slow is fast. Their responses in subsequent events, if they move through the facilities more smoothly and they don't delay, we open the front catch and they walk out without speeding up any of our actions, we've actually increased the rate at which they move through the facilities. So decrease the total time in facility. So that's one of the things that we're learning about some of the practices on the acclimation side. One of the other things that we're focused on is the impact of handler skill. Arguably, everything that we do with cattle and domesticated animals relies on human contact. So we talk a lot about the gaps that exist in between the general public and agriculture. But what we're seeing in the workforce also is a growing gap in background and experience. People that are coming to the workforce that don't have prior experience with animals or not as much as we would have expected. And while we've had this rich, rich history of learned experience working with animals, that was never captured in the peer-reviewed literature. And so we don't have a really rich body of knowledge that describes what skill actually is or which skills are most important for animal production, for profitability. So that's part of what we're working to describe and quantify objectively. And that's some of the things that give me that joy because it draws on those rich experiences, the generational knowledge that I kind of grew up around and lived in a way we're working to capture that and translate it into the peer-reviewed literature so that it can serve the next generations as we continue to go forward, even though that population that's involved in agriculture is shrinking every year, every day. The facilities I talked about just a little bit ago, and it's a bird's eye view, a little bit of the blueprint of the facility, but it gives you this an idea that cattle enter the building the same way, and whichever facility we assign them to would be processed through other system. They'll work through one or the other, and they both enter and then exit the facility in the same place. So essentially, the only difference then, once they're in the building, is which system they're worked through. And preliminarily, what we're seeing is that there is a significant difference in exit speed between the two systems in the first 2,000 head that we've worked through, looking at nothing else. And again, first time through that handling facility. We also have cameras set up here. We have 3 cameras for each system, and that will allow us to do some further work looking at perhaps delay or hesitation, some of the responses or time spent in the different sections of the facility. And we'll look at those as crowd. This is a bud box system, and then there is a crowd, round crowd here. So we'll be able to look at bud box versus crowd, round crowd, and then we'll look at the lead up. Short, basically this dotted line on B and the dotted line on A. We'll also look at behaviors as they exit the squeeze chute. But that gives you a bird's eye view of some of what we're doing right now. And I think with that, we'll probably have some time for questions. But that's what I had for slides.
Thanks, Ruth. That was really, really good. I love that, like the starting of your talk talking about the benefits that the animal actually get from domestication and working with animals. And honestly, I've never really thought about that. Like that's not something that goes on people's mind, at least not on mine. So I
We
appreciate
take it
you.
for granted, actually. I mean,
Yeah.
it was there, and I think that's part of what we're trying to capture is that at some point it was understood more so, and we focused so much on some more of the tangible things that are easier to measure. And it's not that that it hasn't been a consideration or thought about before. It's that in the middle of everything else that we're working to capture and communicate through research, it's it's kind of taken a back seat, and I believe it's really, really important to keep it front and center. I think it resonates with today's consumers, but it also, as we think about you mentioned earlier, people that are just getting into agriculture now to raising, having a couple of pairs. This is really important information, and it will inform a lot of their practices.
Yeah, yeah, and that made me think like, so while in Brazil we did, so the system works a little bit different, and for cow calf operations, there's sometimes situations that you see a cow once and the whole year you don't see anymore, and you see like that exposure to the lack of exposure to human interaction on those environments. You can clearly see like how difficult it is to handle those animals. So like looking from the also the animals will benefit from that, like being acclimated to us a little bit more. So
Right.
that's really, really nice. Um, I think we do have some questions on the Q&A box. Do you want to go ahead and then, read those and answer? I think the first one it was about the recording, so I'm just gonna the record is gonna be available at some point, but the next ones, if you want to go ahead and take those.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can we best, or how best can we implement animal welfare without breaking our budget in a small scale project? And I gave some examples of some of the work that we're doing. I think that helps illustrate that really well. So on a very small scale, something like acclimating cattle to environments would be a great example of something that really gets at welfare without a high cost of investment. Yet there is an ROI that, as we're seeing, Cook showed some of that. If we're achieving puberty earlier, that's a significant lifetime impact of our female in our herd. Similarly, if our breeding rates are improved because of that, again, if we're getting that female bred earlier and on our first attempt, that will affect every subsequent breeding cycle, right? So if we think about that ROI on the females, on the time spent in our herd, that's a pretty low cost investment for something with right now a very high return when we're thinking about what a calf crop was bringing today. So the next question would be, BQA materials tell us about binocular vision. And when cattle look directly in front of them, they also say that they can see limited color. Can you please work BQA so we learners don't get seemingly contradictory information? And that's an excellent point. And there's a link to slides there at Oregon State, which I pulled up. There is somewhat mixed information, and that's one of the challenges that we're working to address in this field. So by saying that cattle are dichromats, that's not contradictory to say that they see in relatively grayscale or limited color. It's very different than ours. So that's not directly contradictory. I understand where that could be perhaps a little confusing, and I'm happy to provide some of the resources about the dichromat and grayscale vision. Uh, but also when we think about binocular vision versus monocular, that really has to do with the overlap between, as we talk about ocular, that refers to the eyes. So binocular really has to do with that area right in front where there is minimal overlap. That concept is pretty well established. And I think that also the question illustrates some of the challenges that we see in materials that are available. We're still learning more in this field, and not all of our materials, even those available through BQA, are perhaps the most up to date. So there's opportunity. Keeps both Juliana and me in jobs as we continue to update those materials with some of the most recent research. And as that's the beauty, is when we know more, we communicate more, and we continue to advance and improve those materials. So point well made.
Yeah, and I think the color thing is something that often confuses people because there's such a history, from the Spanish thing. Like I forgot the name of the whatever they do, like in color and stuff. So
Mhm.
at the end of the day, cows don't see much color. That's the whole thing, right? Like that's what idea.
Right. Historically, I mean, so we think about bullfighting and we think about the
Yeah.
use of red and some of those colors, and that's tradition. And what cattle are responding to in that environment is actually movement.
Yes.
That is one of the things, especially when you have elicited the fight or flight response, that's what cattle are able to see and respond to when they're activated like that. So, contrary to that myth, cattle don't see red, they don't see vision. One of the things that we worked with a lot when I worked in an industry is we wore safety vests, right? So that bright neon yellow, and we were around cattle all the time. And sometimes, in certain instances, cattle would respond to us, and people would think that it was because of the color of the vest. But it's also, think about blaze orange for hunters, right?
Yeah.
The deer don't see the blaze orange, but we see it. So it's a safety issue for the humans. What the cattle do see that they're often responding to in an environment like that is something different. Like when most of the employee crew on that site wears the same color coveralls, for example, like a light gray or navy blue, it's one color and it's solid. And you think about grayscale and contrast, someone wearing a vest, that's a different pattern and a different contrast than what everybody else wears. So we would see behavioral responses in environments where all employees wore the same type of coveralls, for example. So cattle do pick up on differences. They're very keen on those, but it's contrast and shades more than color
Not
and
necessarily
differences.
color.
So the next question would be, can you tell us about solid panels in alleys and pens versus ones that cattle see through? So one of the things, as we think about how important vision is oftentimes it's the strategic placement of solid panels and opportunities where they can see through. So if we're thinking about a bud box, for example, and when we open the gate and we move cattle in, we actually want the opposite end of the bud box to be not solid. We prefer that cattle can see through that. We need space for them to visually see to move into. Then the crowd gate that we shut on them is solid, right? Because that then directs their vision into the alley. And if we think about many of our working facilities and we think about the snake or the single file, oftentimes you'll see, as you go around the country, you'll see differences. Some will be solid the entire way on the inside of the single file. And at others, as you get closer to the squeeze chute or on the inside, if those single files are curved, you'll see maybe half of that side is solid and the upper half is open. Why? Because we need to actually interact visually with cattle to elicit movement. So the opportunity for them to see us is important as long as we stay outside of that point of balance, that pressure zone, when we're not asking them to move. So again, the idea of solid sides and open sides being strategic is really important. What are some tips you have for a new rancher on how to get a good start with cattle in terms of welfare and creating a calm environment? One of my favorites would be the idea of pan feeding. And so this doesn't make sense on a large scale. But if you're starting on a small scale and thinking about cows and setting the tone for your entire herd and how they'll influence generations, one of the most important things that you can do is actually feed cattle in pans, not in a feed bunk, but it requires them to place their head on the ground in a normal grazing posture and begin to approach them, be able to walk through them while they're eating. If you repeat that as a practice every day until you can walk through them, put a hand on them, push them around while they're eating, then start to scratch on them, get a leg up. We've done that a lot with bulls, 1,300-pound bulls. If we were getting them ready to go into Denver, that type of thing. You set them up to be comfortable. So if cattle have their head down and are comfortable, they won't kick, they won't move quickly. For them to respond, they have to pick their head up, right? And so we're asking them to be in a relaxed, normal posture while we're acclimating them to our presence. We're showing them that we're not a threat, and we're essentially creating really healthy patterns that they'll remember for the rest of their life. I'm not a huge fan of hand feeding just because of the size. And as cattle get very gentle and comfortable with humans in close proximity, that can create its own set of problems, right? People have actually been crushed by cattle that have been trying to get food from them when they've been when we get them too gentle and too docile without establishing healthy boundaries, if you will, or good reinforcing movement patterns where they'll move off when we ask. So I like that as an alternative.
Yeah, and I was laughing here because we have a study right now that we have calves in individual pens, and the students that did an amazing job to acclimate them and get them to a situation where they are very docile for the handling. It's very intensive handling, but there's one or two that got to a point that we cannot take them out of the pen because they got too tame, too calm. That is like I
Right,
stand right in front of it trying
right.
to
That's
move
great.
and they don't move around. And at
Right,
the same time, I worry because it's such a small band. I was like, well, if you do take one or two steps, little heifer, you're gonna squeeze me
right.
that wall. So
Exactly.
we have to find a balance, right? So I think those are very valuable advice.
Yes. Well, and I think that leads well into the next question about mentioning the acclimation of cattle to the presence of humans. How long does it take cattle to be acclimated to human presence, or is there no specific time? That's going to be driven by breed influence, by the environment in which you're managing them, whether it's more confined, less confined space, and even your movement patterns. So there isn't a one size fits all. Regularity is really important. What we find is that inconsistent handling actually causes more stress or reaction. So if we're there every day, even if it's just for a few minutes, that will build consistency and dependability. That's something that prey animals really value, is that type of consistency, predictability. So once we, and exposure, I mean, we could be there, we could feed them, put out feed in pans, and only be there for 5 minutes and let them finish. And then over a week, we might spend 10 minutes. And then the third week, we might spend 15 minutes and be walking around. So if we think about gradual changes, it doesn't necessarily require a lot of time at any particular moment, but we're building on a foundation that will be really important over time. How can a producer acclimate cattle to their presence without turning them into pets? I've seen some cattle get so acclimated to the point that they don't respond to a handler's movement cues. And I think that's back to that idea of feeding them on the ground because that's normal for them. So we're not changing their behavior. When we go to hand feed, we put them in positions that elicit other behavioral responses. So if we're holding up, say, a cube, you think about the position in which a calf nurses. Now we have the nose elevated, and oftentimes that will also elicit some of that bunting behavior. If similarly, if we touch the face, the bridge of the nose between the eyes, similarly, we can elicit that type of response. If we're going to, or the poll, so if we're going to touch, scratch cattle, I stay away from the head, stay away from the front. And that's really important because where can they do most of their damage? It's actually their front end. They use their head, right? You think about how dense their skulls are and how they interact with one another. They press, right? So a lot of their strength is in the front. One of the things that we can do but to get cattle really gentle and comfortable with us in close proximity and stay out of their flight zone is to scratch around the tail head, actually to scratch down on the inside of one leg. And if you practice that over time, you can get cattle, even bulls, to lift a leg. And once they've lifted a leg for you, they'll do almost anything. The thing that I like about working around the back half of cattle, when you think about the zone, you want to be not right by the shoulder, right? Or the side, because a cow kick is not comfortable. You're in the zone where you can be kicked if you're there. But if you're back behind them, that's not typically where they'll kick as much. Not to say that you can't be kicked. It's, as you think about risk, a little less risky. You can move animals by pulling their tails. You can push on the tail head and you can put some gentle pressure on the tail and actually get them to shift weight. So that's a way to get them comfortable with you in close proximity with gentle pressure, but also kind of staying out of the danger zone, if you will. The front end is arguably a little more dangerous. So that would be, that'd be some of my advice. Um, uh, and cattle can easily become pets as you acclimate them. So people that spend a lot of time with demonstrating stockmanship and visual pressure, think about it like working a colt, is that you'll use visual pressure and put the amount of visual pressure that you need to actually elicit movement, to ask them to move off of you. That is an important concept to reinforce. That's why some people will carry a stick or some type of tool while they're with cattle, just so that there's something to reinforce their presence. They can maybe create just a little bit of pressure to move an animal off them if they're crowded a little bit too much. Safety is imperative. It's one of the most important things we have to think about. Like, we're not going to win those physical battles. And most times when injuries occur, it's not that animals are always aggressive and coming after people. It's oftentimes the gentle animals too that can create injuries. So those are excellent questions.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very important point. Like you show some data on like fat up, like deaths by livestock and everything, and not necessarily those that were people that were chased, right? It's like likelihood of accidents caused by very tame animals. So very, very nice.
Yeah.
We have quite a few more
So
questions.
yeah, a couple more. There's a lot of overlap, so I'm going to try to pick through them
Yeah.
just a little bit. But the importance of being intentional and slowing down, um, I can't understate that enough. In practical terms, what are the most impactful day-to-day changes handlers can make to reduce stress responses and improve both safety and welfare? So it works both ways. One of the things that we do, we tend to use more noise, perhaps, than um, we even realize. And Ed Pager had some really interesting work out of University of Calgary. He showed that cattle, and when we give them the opportunity to choose, and he did this through preference testing, Y-maze tests, where cattle were exposed to different stimuli, and they had opportunities to learn which stimuli they would experience with whichever direction they chose. And so as they learned that and then they chose a direction, that would say that they wanted to avoid one of the others. So interestingly enough, in those types of preference tests, they didn't choose like yelling more than electric prod, for example. So what that tells us is that they don't find electric prod markedly more aversive than yelling. That means that they see that as apparently equal, which is kind of news to us when we think about how much emphasis we put on avoiding electric prod. So again, that suggests how important sound is to them. So modulating our voices, if many of us might have grown up around people that if they milked, they had a radio on in the parlor. I knew people that had radios on in their barns for their horses. But what something like that does, it's ambient noise. It's at a certain level sort of all the time. When we use our voices to move cattle, there's a percussion to that sound that we believe is aversive. So to talk really low and kind of steady is one thing, and to be like, "Hey, that's percussion," and that's a stimuli that causes response, and is perceived perhaps as more negatively than we would think. So being conscious of avoiding that, so keeping our voices more um, lower frequency and less amplification, I guess, is what I would suggest keeping in mind there. Um, the ranch kids are usually the help handling cattle in my experience, and that's often the case, right? Because they're strong, they've got a lot of energy, right? And they're accessible. The problem is that oftentimes they're the least willing to take advice, and unfortunately, they have to. You described, Melissa, that they often won't listen until they learn something the hard way. That's one of the challenges that we're facing with the changes generationally. Kids would have been able to observe older siblings or even parents experience cause and effect relationships before, and now they're having to learn those themselves. They don't have as much opportunity to experience that. Uh, Helping frame it up front in terms of simply the risk and how risky working with cattle is simply based on their size. Cattle can inadvertently hurt people enormously. All right, just we're not even 10% basically of their weight, right? So physically we're not going to win those battles. Framing it that way is oftentimes one of the most effective things. Um, Although it remains one of our biggest challenges. Also, people tend to overestimate their skill or experience, which continues to contribute to risk. So every chance we get, conveying how much these kids, the people matter to us, is going to hopefully help them hear our message. Like, I really care about you. I don't want to be the one that's responsible for you getting hurt when you're working here. If you get hurt, you're likely not going to be able to work for a while for me or for anyone, right? So we think about consequences. And of course, their brains are still developing, so they don't think about cause and effect and consequences the same way that we do. But every chance we get, describing it that way about their value to us is something that I find helpful.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, but I would add even to stress a little bit more, but like leading by example, right? There's no way we can ask the younger generation to be doing it better if we're not following those principles. So I think that's key.
Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. Kendall says more of a regionalized question, but here in the Southeast, we have a heavy influx of Brahman cattle. How does that fit into some of the research you've done? And do you see differences with them in comparison to more continental breeds? So they tend to be, sometimes they're described as more flighty or reactive. I would describe them as more sensitive because as we think about how Brahman cattle that Bos Indicus are managed around the world, they can be handled and managed and controlled with a string too. So they have the capacity to also become very acclimated and docile and comfortable with humans. So again, it's all how we interact with them. Visually, they're probably more sensitive and reactive initially. And what I have seen, one way that that's managed is oftentimes in the exits of working facilities. So if cattle see a wide open lane while they're in the squeeze chute, you can expect they're ready to run and use up that full space. So oftentimes we'll change what they view. Sometimes when managing or working predominantly Bos Indicus cattle, facilities will they'll either have narrower alleys off of that processing chute, or in some cases even curved. So what we're doing through that is essentially restricting their field of vision and how much opportunity they see for flight. And if we modulate that a little bit, we tend to reduce some of their injuries as well. And bruising would be one of the things that we could see when that flight response is highly activated and they're leaving the squeeze chute. So that's one of those opportunities. Not that differently than some of the practices that I mentioned. Acclimation over time, giving them opportunities to move through facilities, to be exposed to people in their environment, and finding the edge of the flight zone where they orient and acknowledge our presence, but don't flee, and we don't activate that fight or flight response. Our attention to that is going to be really important as we think about acclimating when we're doing something outside of the handling facilities. So that can be managed across breeds. It's going to look very different by breed and environment.
Ruth, and if I may ask a little bit more on that question. So also I work with Brahma and Angus for my PhD and I handle them a lot, but I would always see like at time of production, right? Like Brahma cows calving way more protective. So
Yes.
is the flight zone not flexible, but would change within the time of the production cycle, like during calving, they might have a smaller or larger. Is there any information?
So there's limited information about the flight zone specifically. What changes is the maternal protective instinct and how much that is really, and that's something that appears to be somewhat heritable. So as we have selected cattle and we think about predominantly Angus or continental breeds, and we've looked at things like that hair whorl and that whorl is low, or some of the other things that we call cows based on temperament. What we're also seeing is that there's perhaps, as we select very docile cattle, we're potentially also losing some of that maternal instinct. So that's one of the challenges as we manage domesticated animals. And arguably, we're going to continue to see more challenges there because we don't have the skill level as we might have in years past, or the willingness of our workforce to deal with really protective females and understand what those behaviors are about and how to navigate those really carefully. Some people can be all speak bluntly, be really ballsy, and they can get right in front of one of those cows and keep that calf between them and the cow and tag it and maybe even weigh it, do a few things, and that mama cow is probably blowing snot on them the whole time, but as they keep that calf between them, they're usually okay. And as long as they can step back away outside, far enough away from that calf, they can accomplish what they need to. Not a lot of people are willing to do that anymore. So we see differences between breed types, but also even within breeds based on the selection by temperament. There's again not a lot that's uh, I would say about flight zone specifically in that context. That's why when I talk about flight zone, I say that it changes with the environment. So that's one of the principles that's probably most important to keep in mind when we're thinking about flight zone and point of balance is it's not a fixed thing. It requires us evaluating the cow and how she's responding or the animal that we're looking at. They will tell us what that flight zone is.
Yeah, I guess it's going back to the prey, right? They are prey animals, so whatever is happening to the environment will change that perception. So yeah,
Yeah.
really good point. We have one more question. I think you kind of touched a little bit on that one, but if you want to read that in.
Yeah, Pedro says when working with cattle in the chute or when moving them through handling facilities, what tools do you recommend is the most appropriate and welfare friendly? Also, in your opinion, is there any situation where an electric prod might be justified, or should it be only be considered as an absolute last resort? Um, so I'll answer that kind of in reverse. There are times when a prod is more appropriate than other things, and sometimes is the least aversive of our choices. An example might be even when an animal goes down and it simply needs a little extra, and this is coming from areas where we would have audited this type of thing to animal care standards, and even in some instances, um, care programs that fell right under federal regulation. So I've audited across all types of production. So typically we do look at electric prod as a last resort. But if we're resorting to things like excessive hitting, whether it's with a hand or a paddle or twisting the tail that could result in a broken tail, oftentimes a use of an electric prod, that electrical stimulus might be more appropriate. We might actually provide enough stimulus for a cow to get up when otherwise we might need to have to take other measures to move her. So there's a time and a place. I'm not anti-electric prod. Using it judiciously is always very important. When we're in facilities, if I'm on the outside of the facilities, oftentimes I don't carry anything. When animals are in a single file, oftentimes touching them with your hand can elicit enough of a response to get forward movement. So, but when I'm in a system with cattle, I tend to like a flag or a paddle simply because of being able to use it as an extension of my arm and the size. I don't like rattle paddles, so I will carry a paddle that doesn't have any rattles in it. And I like the ability to place it like ahead of a cow's eye. And that way I can control them visually without actually making contact with them. So that's why I would suggest something like a flag or a paddle. The problem with flags is people tend to whip them through the air and they create more stimulus from just the sound. And we don't necessarily always control that really well. We're not thinking about where that sound might appear because cattle need to understand where sound's coming from too, as you know, in order to respond. So being aware of all of those things is really important. Hopefully that addressed that question. I think Erica asks, how is the welfare subject viewed from the producer side? And I think that's really an excellent question. Arguably, as we think about welfare involving biological functioning, so caring for animals, their nutrition, how all of their biological processes function, producers are addressing that every day. Most producers, particularly in the cow-calf setting, are providing environments for cattle to experience the most natural living that exists in most of livestock production. So right there in those 2 out of 3 of the circles that I talked about, producers are actually meeting some of the primary components, if you will, of welfare for cattle. The one point that we maybe don't evaluate or think about quite as much would be the affective state, or the, if you will, the mental states of animals. And we can even describe that as emotions, or how they experience their environment. And once again, I would bring it back to the natural living and the environment in which we most often raise the majority of beef cattle, and how they spend the majority of their life, largely outside of confinement and in relatively natural environments. So arguably the life of a beef cow, and the cow-calf scenario really addresses the 3 circles of animal welfare really holistically, in ways that not all sectors of agriculture do as easily. Now, when we talk about the actual term, sometimes there's a response that I encounter when we use the term welfare, and argue. So oftentimes I'll situate that conversation by saying we're just talking about caring for animals, the day-to-day practices that are involved in caring for animals well, which is arguably what producers do every day, year round. So sometimes framing that conversation, and reminding them that this is what we're talking about. We're talking about everyday management, and supporting animals being really healthy and successful in the environments that we're managing them, and thinking about what their needs are in those environments. Then we've addressed welfare in terms of the models, the frameworks, but we've identified a little bit of common ground in how we describe it and what we're talking about, so that it isn't something so abstract.
Yeah, we got one more. We're um yes, I think it's a comment.
Yes, yeah. No, yeah, it's a thank you. I appreciate the personal experiences. It was my pleasure to share those, and I really appreciate all of the questions. Excellent questions, and it's I always enjoy being able to answer them. And I think one of the things that's important, even in roles like ours, Juliana, is this idea that we're still learning
Oh yeah.
what we're working on. These aren't wholly defined. It isn't black and white. When we know better, we do better. When we know more, and that's what gives us job security. There's so much more that we are working to understand, and understand better and in more depth. So that's one of the things that keeps me motivated and really excited about the work that we're doing, especially when we think about the value that
Mm.
producers bring to the table every day, the value that they contribute to the lives of the animals in their care, and the values that they bring to their communities and to the world. And to get to be a little part of that is really an honor.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think you just summarized a lot what have been through my mind tonight. I like, and going back to what we discussed at earlier yesterday and earlier today, we're here to help. We are learning a lot. There's so many questions. I guess my list of things I don't know, it's much bigger than the list of things we know, but whatever we know a little bit, we want to spread and make sure that other people's get access to it, right? Because like when we that's how we improve. That's how we get better. So really appreciate everything you share with us
Thank
tonight,
you.
Ruth. It was amazing. All the slides and all your experience and your opinions on the conversation we have earlier today. So really, really appreciate you joining us and, willing to be a part of this community. Before we finish, we do have the prize drawing. So we do have 24 attendees. So if you can pick a number from 1 to 24.
I'm going to pick 12.
12. So let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so it's Melissa Ward. I will email you to get your information, but you are the winner of tonight. So I guess that's everything we have for tonight. Thank you again, Ruth, very much. Dr. Woiwode.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to join your community and to spend a wonderful evening talking about one of my favorite subjects. So,
Oh,
I'm happy to share my slides with you. My email was on my final slide. I welcome questions, anyone reaching out to. So, happy to continue the conversation even beyond tonight.
perfect. Thank you very much. And if you guys are attending tonight, let me know if you have questions or forward to Ruth or you go directly to her. And I think that's all we have for tonight. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night. And I hope to see you tomorrow for our last night with Kacie McCarthy. She'll be talking more on the nutrition side, think about younger cattle, things on those lines. So hope to see you out tomorrow night. Thanks, Ruth. Good
Thank
night.
you. Have a great evening, everyone.